The hospital corridor was the kind of quiet that sits wrong in your chest. Not peaceful, hollow. The overhead lights ran the full length of the hallway in a single cold strip of white. And somewhere behind a closed door, a monitor beeped in slow mechanical rhythm. Dochka. I'd been sitting in that plastic chair for over 2 hours. Back straight, elbows on my knees. Hands folded like I was in a waiting room for something I hadn't yet been told to fear. My name is Daniel Brooks. I was 38 years old, and I had not slept properly in 6 weeks. I was an architect by trade. I designed spaces meant to make people feel something. Openness, warmth, belonging. But at that point in my life, my own apartment felt like a project I'd abandoned halfway through. The divorce had been finalized 4 months earlier, and I'd moved into a rental unit in a building I'd never have chosen for a client. Low ceilings, a kitchen that faced a brick wall, rooms that echoed when I moved through them because I hadn't bothered to furnish them yet. The irregular heartbeat had started 6 weeks after she left. The first time it happened, I was sitting at my drafting table at 2 a.m, staring at blueprints that suddenly seemed meaningless. My chest clenched, released. Clenched again, not like pain exactly, but like something skipping, like a record jumping a groove. My doctor sent me for tests. The tests came back inconclusive. She referred me to a cardiologist. Botched actually. The cardiologist wanted a full overnight monitoring workup. And that was why I was here, in the cardiology wing of Meridian General, waiting to be called back in after a technician had attached a new round of sensors. The corridor smelled of antiseptic and something faintly floral. Probably from a diffuser plugged in near the nurse's station. The nurse's station itself sat about 30 feet from where I was. I'd watched the shift change happen an hour ago. A quiet, almost ceremonial handoff of clipboards and quiet words. The night's staff moved differently than the day's staff. More careful, more deliberate. That was when I first noticed her. She came out from behind the station, carrying 2 folders and a cup of something hot. She was around 30, maybe 32, with dark hair pulled back tightly, and the kind of face that didn't waste expressions. She glanced at me once when she passed, not the way most people glance at someone sitting in a hallway. The way you clock a piece of furniture. She looked at me the way someone checks a door to make sure it's still locked. And then she moved on. Her name tag read, E.I. Carter, RNNY. I watched her for the next 20 minutes without meaning to die. There was something in the way she carried herself that was different from the rest of the staff. She wasn't hurried, but she was alert. The kind of alert that isn't about her job. Her eyes moved across the corridor in a pattern. Doorways. The elevator at the far end. The side exit near the vending machines. She was watching the space the way I watched structural drawings, looking for the thing that didn't belong. At the time, I told myself she was just tired, or careful, or thorough. I was wrong on all of those. It was close to midnight when she approached me directly for the first time. I'd been called back once to have my blood pressure checked and my sensor readings reviewed. Then asked to wait again in the corridor while the overnight team ran a longer analysis. So I was still in that chair. Still alone. The corridor had emptied out. Somewhere a cart rolled by. Turned a corner. And disappeared. She walked toward me without looking at me, the way you approach something you don't want to draw attention to. She sat down in the chair beside mine, not across from me. Beside me, and for a moment she didn't speak. She looked straight ahead. She picked up a pen and opened a folder across her knee like she was just taking notes at a nearby station. Then she leaned in slightly, and her voice was barely above a breath. "If you leave right now," she said, "you might save someone's life." I turned to look at her. She didn't turn toward me. "I'm sorry. What?" "Don't repeat it. Don't react. Just listen." She wrote something in the folder like she was documenting a routine observation. "Your results have been moved into the overnight processing queue. You won't be seen again for at least 2 more hours. Walk to the front exit, tell the desk you're getting air. And then, keep walking. My first instinct was that she was burned out. I'd heard stories about night shift staff unraveling after too many hours under fluorescent lights. I'd known people in demanding fields who started saying things that didn't track. Architects, engineers, surgeons. Pressure does something to logic eventually. But then, I looked at her hands. She was gripping the pen hard enough that the tips of her fingers had gone slightly pale. And her handwriting, which I could see from the angle I was sitting, had gotten smaller, tighter, like she was trying to contain something. That wasn't someone unraveling. That was someone holding themselves together by force. I was about to speak again when I heard footsteps at the far end of the corridor. She straightened up immediately and shifted the folder to her other arm. Her expression went completely neutral, back to being a nurse doing rounds. The change was so fast it made my skin go cold. The man walking toward us was heavyset, in his mid-40s, wearing a collared shirt under a hospital badge. He wasn't in scrubs. He wasn't a patient. He moved like someone who knew exactly where every camera was positioned in a building. Pot. He looked at us both as he passed. Not a glance, a look. A few seconds of deliberate attention, directed first at her, then at me, then away. She said nothing. She wrote something else in the folder. Her left hand, I noticed, was pressing flat against her thigh. I sat in that corridor for another 12 minutes before I made a decision that, under any other circumstances, I would have considered irrational. I got up. I walked to the front desk and told them I needed some air. The young man behind the desk nodded. He'd heard that 100 times from 100 different people, and I walked through the glass doors and out into the night. The air outside was cold and smelled of rain that hadn't fallen yet. The city hummed at low frequency, the way it does at midnight, not silent, but muted. I stood under the overhang for a moment, breathing doubtfully. I was still trying to understand what I was doing out here when I heard it. The sound of tires screaming against pavement. Then the heavy crunch of metal and glass as an ambulance entering the emergency bay on the far side of the building made contact with something in the dark. Lights flashed. People started shouting. I watched from a distance as the emergency entrance became a controlled eruption of movement. Something had gone wrong in there. Something had happened. And the timing was close enough to what Emily had said that I couldn't dismiss it as coincidence. I stepped back from the overhang and into the shadow of a concrete pillar near the parking structure. That was when I saw him, the man in the collared shirt standing just inside the glass doors, looking out. He wasn't watching the ambulance bay. He was watching the entrance I'd just walked through. He was looking for me. I didn't move. I stayed against that pillar until he turned away and disappeared back into the corridor. Then I walked to my car and sat behind the wheel for a long time without starting the engine. I didn't sleep that night. I got home, sat on the edge of an unmade bed, and tried to build a timeline that made sense. An irregular heartbeat, a cardiologist, an overnight test, a nurse who spoke in code and watched doorways, a man who didn't belong to any department I could identify. A crash at the exact moment I left. At 3 a.m, my phone rang. Dutch, unknown number. I picked up before I'd made the decision to. It's Emily Carter. Her voice was lower than it had been in the hospital, more certain. I need you to listen carefully. I'm listening. A patient was removed from the active roster tonight. Not discharged, removed. His records were reclassified and his room was reassigned before the attending physician on call had been notified. She paused. His name is listed in the incident file as Daniel Brooks, 38 years old, cardiology wing Torchio. The silence between us was very long. That's my name, I said. I know. What does that mean? What happened to whoever they did this to? I don't know yet. That's the part I can't see from where I sit. Another pause. What I do know is that your file was flagged 2 days ago. Before you even checked in. Someone inside the system put a marker on your record. I sat in the dark of my unfurnished apartment and tried to process that. Someone had flagged me before I arrived. Before I'd even set foot in that building. Why are you telling me this? I asked. She didn't answer right away. When she did, the words came out quieter than the ones before them. Because someone should have told my brother. She ended the call before I could ask what she meant. No. We met 2 days later at a small cafe near the university district. The kind of place with mismatched chairs and hand-lettered menus that stayed busy enough that no one paid attention to two strangers leaning across a corner table. She was in regular clothes for the first time. Dark jacket, a gray sweater underneath. She looked like someone who'd been awake as long as I had, which I suspected was true. She set a folder on the table between us. Not the kind from the hospital, a personal one, soft-sided, clearly assembled over a long of time. There's a structure inside Meridian General. She said, "Doctor. It's been running for at least 4 years, possibly longer." She spoke in the careful, even tone of someone who'd rehearsed this conversation many times, possibly alone. It starts with records. When a patient dies in circumstances that could expose negligence, surgical error, medication failure, monitoring gaps, the records get adjusted, not falsified entirely, just shaped, key timestamps altered, reading slightly modified. The kind of changes that wouldn't trigger an audit unless someone knew exactly what they were looking for. How does a patient get flagged in advance? That part took me longer to understand. She wrapped both hands around her coffee. There are certain patients who represent higher liability. People with pending insurance claims. People who've filed formal complaints. People who've had prior incidents at other facilities. Someone runs those markers against incoming patients and flags the ones that need special handling. And I was flagged because of what? Your insurance claim from 18 months ago. You filed a complaint against a surgical team at Westfield Medical after your father's procedure. I remembered. My father had gone in for a routine valve repair and spent 11 days in intensive care afterward because of a post-op infection the team had failed to catch early. He survived, but barely. I'd filed a formal complaint with the state medical board, Dochke. Nothing had come of it. That complaint went into a shared database. Emily said. Meridian pulls from that database. You were marked as a potential liability patient before your cardiologist ever submitted your referral. And what does special handling mean? She looked at me for a moment. It means your outcome becomes manageable. The word landed carefully, deliberately, the way words do when someone doesn't want to say a thing any plainer than they have to. Emily, Doctor. I kept my voice steady. What happened to the person in that room after I left? She looked down at the table. I don't know. His record doesn't exist in any system I can access anymore. I didn't trust her completely, not yet. That would have been a different kind of foolishness. She was asking me to believe something large and frightening on the basis of a folder she'd assembled on her own time and a phone call in the middle of the night. I'd been lied to before by people I'd trusted with far more than a hospital stay. My ex-wife hadn't been dishonest in a dramatic way. It was quieter than that. The slow accumulation of small untruths that only reveal their pattern when viewed from the far side of an ending. So I asked Emily the thing I needed to ask. Why does this fall on you? You're a nurse. You could walk away from this building, find a job somewhere else, and never look back. She was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, she wasn't looking at me anymore. She was looking at the window, at the gray sky above the street. My brother's name was Marcus. He was 26. She said it the way people say things they've repeated to themselves in private, until the words are smooth from handling. He went into a hospital in this city 6 years ago with a kidney infection. Standard treatment, standard protocol. He should have been home in 4 days. A pause. He wasn't. She didn't fill in all the details. She didn't have to. I found out 2 years later that there had been a medication error on the third night. The nurse on duty, not me, I wasn't there yet, I was still in school, had flagged it. She'd written a note. The note disappeared from the file before the next shift supervisor reviewed it. The doctor who authorized the dosage change was never formally questioned. She turned back to me. Her eyes were dry. I had the sense she'd run out of tears for this particular story a long time ago. I finished nursing school, she said, and I came here. The thing I felt then wasn't pity. It was recognition, not diet. The particular weight of someone who has organized their entire life around a wound they cannot let close, because closing it would feel like surrender. I'm sorry about Marcus, I said, Dara. She nodded once, like she was accepting something she'd been offered carefully. I don't want you to get hurt because of this. And yet you pulled me into it. I pulled you out of it. She looked at me steadily. There's a difference. I didn't go home that evening. I went back to my drafting table, opened a blank page, and started mapping what I knew the way I would map a building. Structure first, then load points. Then the places where things were most likely to fail. 3 days later, I called her. I want to help, I said. That's not what I expected you to say. It's what I decided. We began working methodically. Emily had already spent months gathering fragments, copies of altered records, timestamps that didn't align, names that reappeared across multiple incident files in ways that couldn't be coincidence. What she lacked was someone who could help her build the pieces into an architecture that held. That's what I did. I structured the evidence. We met in the evenings. Mostly at the cafe, but sometimes at my apartment, which gradually began to feel less like an empty space as those nights accumulated. She brought her folders. I brought legal pads and a laptop batch. We spread everything across the kitchen table and worked through it the way you work through a building problem, finding the load-bearing elements, stripping away what didn't connect. There were nights when the work slowed and we talked instead. She told me about growing up in Ohio, about a father who drove a delivery truck and a mother who taught elementary school and a brother who wanted to be a park ranger. I told her about the early years of my marriage, the good ones, when my ex-wife and I had renovated a small house in the hills and worked side by side for 2 weekends, sanding floors until our arms gave out. I told her about my father's surgery, the 11 days in intensive care, the particular helplessness of sitting in a hospital chair, not unlike the chair I'd been sitting in when she found me. She laughed once, briefly, at something I said about the coffee in the cafe being genuinely terrible. It was a small laugh, surprised out of her. And it changed the quality of the room in the way that unexpected small things sometimes do. I didn't name what I was feeling then. Neither of us did. We had something more immediate to finish first. The night it fell apart, I was alone in the cafe, waiting for Emily with a USB drive containing the most complete version of the compiled file we'd built. She was 20 minutes late, which was unusual. She was one of those people whose relationship with time is almost architectural, precise, and reliable. When she arrived, her face told me before she spoke. They know, Dottie. She sat down across from me without taking off her jacket. Mitchell, the man you saw in the corridor that first night, he's not just on staff. He runs the risk management division for the entire Meridian network. 3 facilities. He pulled my personnel file this morning and sent it to the department director. What does that mean for you? Administrative suspension, pending investigation. Tarta. She set her bag on the table. They're framing it as a documentation irregularity. I made a procedural error 6 months ago. Minor, I self-reported it. It was handled. And now suddenly it's a pattern of negligence. I looked at her hands. They were steady this time. That almost made it worse. "There's more," she said. "Someone left a message on my phone last night. No name, just a voice." She paused. "They said the same thing to me that they said to you, except it wasn't a question." She didn't tell me the exact words. She didn't have to. I understood the shape of them. 2 days later, I got my own version. A printed note, slipped under my apartment door. 4 sentences. The last one read, "What you think you know is less than what you don't. Walk away from this now, and that stays true." I read it 3 times. Then I folded it and put it in the file. Emily called me that evening and said the thing I had been afraid she would say. "You should stop," she said. "Doctor, I mean it. This isn't worth your safety." My name was on that record, Emily. I know. They put my name on someone else's file and then erased it. Someone sat in a room somewhere and made a decision about whether I was a manageable liability. I don't know what happened to the person in that room after I left, and you want me to walk away from that. She was quiet. "You're the one who chose not to walk away from Marcus." I said, 6 years ago. You could have grieved and moved on. You chose to become a nurse and come to this hospital and spend years building a case while holding down a full shift. Don't tell me walking away is the answer." Another long silence. Then she said, "The complete file. Everything we've compiled. It needs to go somewhere that can't be buried. Not a complaint board. Somewhere that can actually move on it." "I know someone," I said. Her name was Rachel Nguyen, and she was an investigative reporter at a regional publication with a national reach. I'd known her slightly through a former colleague. We'd been introduced at an industry event years earlier. And she'd written a piece on adaptive architecture in underserved neighborhoods that I'd read and respected. I reached out to her the next morning. She met with me alone first. She asked hard questions in a quiet room. The kind of questions that come from someone who knows what a bad source looks like and has been burned before. I gave her everything I had. The compiled file, the altered timestamp stashed top, the flagging system, the records that didn't exist anymore, the note under my door. She went quiet for a long time after reading through the first quarter of the file. "This is real," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "Do you have the nurse's cooperation?" "She's suspended right now, pending a fake misconduct review." "That's actually worse for them if this goes public," she said. "That's retaliation against a source. That becomes part of the story." I called Emily from the parking lot outside Rachel's office. "Doctor, I need you to decide." I said, "Do it." "Rachel can protect your identity during the initial reporting phase. But eventually your name will be part of this. It'll have to be." The pause on the other end was long enough that I wasn't sure she was still there. "Emily, I'm here." Another breath. I'm thinking about Marcus." "I know. He'd think this was the right thing." I could hear something shifting in her voice, not breaking, but releasing. "He was always braver than I was. He used to say that the worst thing you can do is know something is wrong and decide it's not your problem." A quiet exhale. "Dr. Wan, tell your reporter I'll talk to her." We met at Rachel's office that same evening, all 3 of us at a round table with the compiled evidence spread out in order. Emily walked Rachel through every element with the clarity and precision of someone who has known this material for a long time. She didn't waver once. She answered every question directly. When Rachel asked about the night she'd approached me in the corridor, Emily described it simply and without embellishment. "I'd seen his file flagged," she said. "I'd seen what happened to flag patients when the system had time to work. I wasn't going to watch it happen again." Rachel looked at me across the table. "And you just believed her?" she asked. I believed her hands. I said. She was terrified. You don't fake that kind of terrified. The story broke on a Tuesday morning, 6 weeks after that conversation. It ran first in Rachel's publication, picked up within 48 hours by 3 national outlets. The piece was careful, precise, and devastating. It named the system, named the mechanism, and named the people responsible for building it. Mitchell's name appeared in the 4th paragraph. His superior's name appeared in the 6th. By Thursday, the state medical board had opened a formal investigation. By the following Monday, the district attorney's office had issued a preservation order on Meridian General's full records database. 3 senior administrators, including Mitchell, were placed on administrative leave and later formally charged with obstruction of justice, falsification of medical records, and patient endangerment. My own file, the flagged one. The altered one, the one with my name attached to a record that had been made to disappear, was recovered from a backup archive that the network's IT team hadn't been informed to wipe. The state investigator who called me about it was careful in the way investigators are when they found something they weren't expecting. Mr. Brooks, she said, I want to be transparent with you. We found the file, we found the flag, we found the alteration history. A pause. Whatever happened to you that night, whatever would have happened if you'd stayed, you were right to leave. Emily's suspension was reversed within the first week of the investigation. The documentation irregularity they'd used to justify it was reclassified as the retaliatory action it had always been. Her personnel record was cleared. She was offered reinstatement with back pay and a formal written apology from the hospital's board of directors. She called me when she got the letter. It's very polite, she said. Very thorough, very much written by a lawyer. Does it help? She considered this honestly. Not with Marcus, she said. Talk. Nothing's going to help with Marcus, but it helps with the part of me that was worried the whole thing had been for nothing. 4 months after the story ran, I went back to Meridian General Deutsch. Not for a test, not for a follow-up appointment, though my cardiologist had cleared me months earlier. The irregular heartbeat had apparently been stress-induced and had resolved with something embarrassingly simple: regular sleep, less caffeine, and fewer evenings spent alone at a drafting table redesigning an apartment that already didn't feel like home. I went to see Emily. She was back on days now. She requested a shift change as part of her reinstatement, and they'd granted it. The cardiology wing looked different in daylight. What? Warmer, or maybe just more human. There were get-well cards taped to some of the doors. A child's drawing of a dog was pinned to a bulletin board near the nurse's station. She came out from a room at the end of the corridor and stopped when she saw me. Then she kept walking. You came, she said. I said I would. She had a few minutes before her next round. We sat in the chairs outside the corridor window. Not the plastic waiting chairs from that first night, but better ones. Near a window that faced west and let in the afternoon light and long. Warm angles across the floor. We didn't talk about the case. There was nothing left to say about it that hadn't already been said in courtrooms and investigators' offices and a long phone call on a Tuesday morning when the story went live. We talked about other things. She told me she was thinking about applying for a position in the hospital's patient advocacy program. A new one. Built partly in response to everything that had come out of the investigation. I told her I'd finally furnished my apartment and that I'd chosen a building across town with higher ceilings and a kitchen that faced a garden. Better than a brick wall, she said. Considerably. At some point, the light from the window shifted and she said she had to get back. She stood, and I stood with her. And for a moment, we were just 2 people in a hospital corridor at the end of an ordinary afternoon. Which felt, after everything, like a remarkable thing to be. Daniel, she said, Yeah. She looked at me steadily, the same way she had that first night across a dim cafe table, direct, without performance, without pretense. I'm glad you left that night. I'm glad you told me to. She held my gaze for a moment longer, and there was something in that look that wasn't quite finished. Something that had been building slowly over months of late evenings, and careful work, and coffee that was genuinely terrible, and one small, surprised laugh. And neither of us named it. We didn't need to yet. There was time. That was the thing we'd both been given back that neither of us had expected. Time. And someone to spend parts of it with. She went back down the corridor. I watched her go, and then I turned and walked toward the front exit, through the glass doors, and out into the afternoon. The light was nothing like it had been that first night. It wasn't cold and white and clinical. It was gold and low, and it came at an angle that made everything it touched look a little more worth keeping. I stood under it for a long moment before I walked to my car. The clenching in my chest, the one that had started 6 weeks after my marriage ended and sent me to cardiologists and monitoring rooms and cold corridor chairs at midnight, was gone. It had been gone for a while. Actually, I just hadn't stopped long enough to notice. What happened that night began with a whisper, and a choice I didn't fully understand. And a woman with steady hands and a grief she'd turned into something useful. And what it ended with, or rather, what it opened into, was quieter than I would have expected. Not a resolution. Not a conclusion. Just a door, cracked slightly open, with warm light coming through. I had not been looking for that when I walked into Meridian General. But then again, the best things I've ever found were never things I went looking for. They were things that found me in a corridor at midnight and told me to walk toward the door.